47 members of Congress just demanded the resignation of a sitting president, not a censure, not an impeachment inquiry, a direct call for resignation, and 12 of those voices belong to his own party. We're witnessing the largest bipartisan break from a sitting president in modern American history. Think about what that means. These aren't fringe legislators or political opportunists. These are established members of both parties, including Republican leadership figures who built their careers supporting conservative principles and party loyalty. According to sources familiar with the discussions, this unprecedented coalition formed in exactly 72 hours, 3 days. That's how long it took for private concerns to become public demands that could reshape American democracy. While the White House was busy dismissing media reports as partisan attacks, Congress was conducting the most serious constitutional discussions since Watergate. The conversations weren't happening in committee rooms or public hearings. They were taking place in secure offices, behind closed doors, with members speaking on background about concerns that transcended party politics. Here's what makes this truly significant. Republican leaders who have defended every controversial decision for years are now stating publicly that certain lines cannot be crossed. We're talking about legislators with decades of institutional loyalty suddenly prioritizing constitutional obligations over political allegiance. The timeline reveals the urgency. Tuesday morning, isolated concerns. Tuesday afternoon, bipartisan conversations. Wednesday evening, formal coalition. Thursday dawn, public declaration. That's not normal political maneuvering. That's institutional crisis response. According to congressional sources speaking on condition of anonymity, the discussions began with questions about executive authority and ended with demands for accountability that no one thought possible just weeks ago. The speed of this development suggests something fundamental shifted in Washington's calculus. And here's where it gets devastating. The resignation demand isn't coming from the usual suspects. It's coming from members who represent districts that delivered overwhelming electoral support. It's coming from legislators whose political survival depends on maintaining party unity, yet they're willing to risk everything. We're not talking about political theater. We're talking about constitutional conviction that overrides political calculation. When institutional Republicans start prioritizing constitutional concerns over party loyalty, the landscape has changed permanently. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from as this historic moment unfolds. This story is developing in real time across the country, but this is just the beginning, because what triggered this unprecedented response will shock you even more. The classified briefing that changed everything for these Republican leaders reveals why party loyalty suddenly became secondary to constitutional duty, and that revelation exposes something far more serious than political disagreement. The classified briefing that changed everything happened on a Monday morning at 9:15. Inside the secure briefing room, intelligence officials presented information that transformed Republican loyalty into constitutional alarm within hours. According to sources present during the session, the briefing contained evidence of systematic disregard for protocols that protect national security infrastructure, not policy disagreements, not political maneuvering, direct violations of security procedures that intelligence professionals described as unprecedented in scope and consequence. Here's what broke Republican resolve. The intelligence community had been issuing escalating warnings for months about specific behaviors that compromise sensitive operations. Each warning was either ignored, dismissed, or actively countermanded. By the time of Monday's briefing, the damage assessment required immediate congressional notification. Think about what that means. Intelligence professionals who brief presidents on the most sensitive national security matters were compelled to brief Congress about presidential actions that endangered those same operations. That's not political opposition, that's institutional survival. The pattern revealed in the briefing showed escalating behavior that crossed what Republican leaders privately called red lines. Sources familiar with the intelligence assessment describe a systematic erosion of security protocols that began as carelessness and evolved into deliberate defiance of established safeguards. According to former national security officials speaking on background, the briefing detailed specific incidents where classified information was handled in ways that violated every existing protocol. The intelligence assessment concluded that standard security measures were no longer sufficient to protect sensitive operations. But here's where it gets truly significant. The same Republican leaders who had defended every controversial decision for years left that briefing room asking different questions, not about political strategy or media management, about constitutional obligations and institutional survival. Former CIA Director Harrison stated last week that when intelligence professionals begin expressing concerns about executive behavior to Congress, the system is activating its most serious safeguards. That's not speculation. That's institutional crisis response. The transformation happened overnight. Democrat requests for accountability that Republicans had dismissed for months suddenly became bipartisan demands that Republicans were leading. Sources describe the shift as unprecedented in modern congressional history. Within 12 hours of the briefing, Republican leadership was conducting private discussions about constitutional authority and executive overreach. Within 24 hours, those discussions included specific timelines for public statements. Within 48 hours, the resignation demands were drafted. According to constitutional scholars familiar with similar historical precedents, this sequence represents the fastest institutional response to executive behavior since the Saturday Night Massacre. The speed indicates the severity of the underlying concerns. Dr. Margaret Chen, professor of constitutional law at Georgetown, confirmed that when both parties begin questioning executive authority simultaneously, the constitutional framework is operating exactly as designed. The system recognizes threats to institutional integrity and responds accordingly. And it gets worse, because the intelligence briefing that broke Republican loyalty was just the first revelation. The ongoing investigation that prompted that briefing has uncovered additional evidence that makes Monday's session look like a warning shot. The full scope of what triggered this constitutional crisis reveals why resignation demands became the moderate position. The Republican Party fractured in real time over 48 hours, and it started with a phone call that no one saw coming. According to sources familiar with the internal discussions, the breaking point came when veteran Republican leadership received polling data from their own districts showing constituent alarm at unprecedented levels. We're talking about traditionally safe Republican seats where approval ratings dropped 23 points in 2 weeks. Think about what that represents. These are districts that delivered overwhelming electoral support just months ago, districts where party loyalty runs generational. Yet voters were expressing concerns that transcended political allegiance and touched constitutional principles. The private conversations between GOP leadership and rank and file members revealed a party grappling with institutional survival versus political calculation. Sources present during these discussions describe them as the most serious internal debates since the party's formation. Here's where it gets devastating for traditional Republican unity. The younger GOP members weren't following leadership on this issue, they were leading it. Representatives with less than 6 years in Congress were driving conversations about constitutional obligations, while 20-year veterans struggled to balance party loyalty with institutional concerns. According to congressional sources speaking on background, the geographic split within the Republican caucus created an unprecedented situation. Western state Republicans were expressing constitutional concerns, while Southern state Republicans were maintaining traditional party positions. That regional divide hasn't existed since Reconstruction. The financial pressure was equally unprecedented. Major Republican donors were privately expressing concerns about continued support for leadership that ignored intelligence community warnings. Sources familiar with donor conversations describe anxiety about long-term party viability if constitutional questions remained unaddressed. But here's what makes this truly significant. The 48-hour period of intensive party negotiations wasn't about political strategy or damage control. It was about whether the Republican Party would prioritize institutional integrity over political expediency. Former Republican strategist David Morrison, who worked on presidential campaigns for over 2 decades, confirmed that internal party debates about constitutional obligations represent uncharted territory. When Republicans start questioning executive authority, the political landscape shifts permanently. The timeline reveals the urgency and the fracture. Monday evening, unified party support. Tuesday morning, private concerns among leadership. Tuesday afternoon, district polling showing constituent alarm. Wednesday morning, younger members demanding action. Wednesday evening, veteran leadership joining constitutional discussions. According to party officials familiar with the negotiations, the discussions included specific conversations about political survival versus constitutional duty. Multiple sources describe these as the most serious internal debates in modern Republican history. The polling data that broke traditional GOP unity showed something unprecedented. Voters in Republican strongholds were expressing concerns about constitutional authority at levels typically seen only during major scandals. But this wasn't scandal response. This was institutional concern. Dr. Sarah Phillips, who studies congressional behavior at Harvard, stated that when internal party polling shows constitutional concerns superseding political loyalty, the democratic system is operating as designed. Voters were demanding institutional accountability regardless of party affiliation. And here's where it gets worse for party unity. The intelligence briefing that started this constitutional crisis was just the beginning of a broader investigation. Additional evidence emerging from that investigation has created pressure that makes Monday's briefing look like a preliminary warning. The constitutional implications revealed by ongoing discoveries explain why resignation demands became the moderate Republican position. The fracture within the Republican Party isn't healing, it's accelerating, because what comes next makes partisan loyalty impossible to maintain when constitutional obligations demand immediate action. Constitutional scholars are calling this the most serious institutional crisis since Nixon. But this situation is fundamentally different, and the legal pathways available to Congress extend far beyond what most Americans understand about presidential accountability. According to Professor James Whitfield at Yale Law School, congressional resignation demands carry constitutional weight that transcends political theater. When both parties question executive authority simultaneously, the system activates safeguards designed specifically for institutional protection. Here's what makes this unprecedented. The constitutional framework provides multiple pathways for congressional response to executive behavior that threatens institutional integrity. Impeachment represents just one option. Congressional oversight, budgetary authority, and constitutional interpretation create additional mechanisms for institutional accountability. Think about what that means. The resignation demands aren't political theater. They're constitutional pressure designed to activate executive self-reflection before more serious institutional responses become necessary. Sources familiar with constitutional law describe this as the system operating exactly as designed. The historical precedents reveal why this moment carries such constitutional weight. During Watergate, congressional pressure built over months through committee investigations and media revelations. This situation compressed that timeline into days through intelligence briefings that left no room for political interpretation. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, constitutional scholar at Columbia, confirmed that when intelligence community warnings prompt immediate bipartisan congressional response, the constitutional system recognizes existential threats to democratic governance. The speed indicates the severity of institutional concerns. But here's where the constitutional implications get truly serious. Behind the public resignation demands, Congress is conducting private discussions about 25th Amendment procedures that haven't been seriously considered since Reagan's hospitalization. Sources familiar with these discussions describe them as institutional contingency planning. According to former Justice Department officials speaking on background, the constitutional questions raised by recent intelligence briefings extend beyond individual executive decisions to systematic patterns that threaten governmental functionality. This isn't about political disagreement. This is about institutional survival. The legal pathways being discussed in Congress include constitutional authorities that haven't been exercised in decades, congressional oversight powers, budgetary controls, and institutional accountability mechanisms that exist specifically for moments when executive behavior threatens democratic governance. Former Attorney General Patricia Rodriguez stated last week that constitutional safeguards activate automatically when institutional integrity faces systemic threats. The resignation demands represent constitutional pressure before more serious institutional responses become constitutionally required. And here's what constitutional experts find most alarming. The judicial branch is expressing concerns that align perfectly with congressional warnings. Federal judges are beginning to reference institutional stability in rulings that suggest broader constitutional anxiety about executive authority. According to sources familiar with judicial discussions, federal courts are observing executive behavior patterns that raise questions about constitutional compliance beyond individual case decisions. When judicial and legislative branches begin expressing similar institutional concerns, constitutional crisis becomes constitutional inevitability. Dr. Michael Harrison, who advised three previous administrations on constitutional questions, confirmed that the current situation represents constitutional territory that the founders specifically anticipated but hoped would never be necessary to navigate. The system is operating as designed, but operating at maximum constitutional capacity. The 25th Amendment discussions happening in Congress aren't theoretical constitutional exercises. They're practical planning sessions for institutional scenarios that intelligence briefings suggest could become immediately relevant. Sources describe these as the most serious constitutional discussions since the Cold War. And it gets worse, because the constitutional crisis triggered by intelligence community warnings is accelerating through pressure mechanisms that make resignation demands look like preliminary constitutional courtesy. The institutional forces now activating haven't been fully deployed since the Constitutional Convention itself. What comes next will test every safeguard the founders built into American democracy. The pressure campaign isn't coming from Washington alone. It's coming from every direction simultaneously. And the coordination reveals institutional forces that haven't aligned like this since the Civil War. According to sources familiar with the discussions, state party officials are conducting unprecedented coordination with congressional leadership about constitutional concerns. We're talking about state-level Republicans actively supporting federal constitutional pressure. That's not normal party politics. That's institutional alignment across governmental levels. Here's what makes this coordination devastating for traditional executive support. The same state officials who organized electoral victories are now organizing constitutional accountability. Sources describe conversations between state and federal Republicans as the most serious institutional discussions in modern party history. The media coverage is amplifying the constitutional message beyond Washington political circles. Major networks are dedicating primetime coverage to constitutional law experts rather than political commentators. That shift indicates institutional recognition that this transcends partisan politics. Think about what that means. When major media outlets prioritize constitutional analysis over political strategy, the landscape has shifted from political crisis to institutional crisis. The coverage pattern suggests systematic preparation for constitutional procedures that haven't been necessary in decades. Corporate and donor responses reveal pressure beyond political considerations. According to sources familiar with major donor conversations, traditional Republican financial supporters are expressing concerns about continued association with leadership that ignores constitutional warnings from intelligence professionals. The financial pressure represents institutional survival concerns rather than political calculation. Major corporate donors are privately questioning whether continued support for constitutional defiance represents acceptable business risk. Sources describe these conversations as unprecedented in their constitutional focus. But here's where the pressure gets truly systematic. International allies are communicating constitutional concerns through diplomatic channels that bypass traditional executive communication pathways. According to diplomatic sources, allied governments are expressing alarm about institutional stability that affects international agreements and security cooperation. The diplomatic pressure isn't about policy disagreements or political preferences. It's about governmental reliability for international commitments that require constitutional stability. When allies begin questioning institutional functionality, the pressure transcends domestic politics. According to former State Department officials speaking on background, diplomatic concerns about constitutional stability represent the most serious international pressure since Watergate. Allied governments are quietly preparing contingency plans for institutional scenarios that could affect international obligations. The timeline of escalating pressure reveals coordination that spans multiple institutional levels. Monday, intelligence briefing. Tuesday, congressional response. Wednesday, state party coordination. Thursday, corporate donor concerns. Friday, international diplomatic pressure. That's systematic institutional alignment. Sources familiar with the coordination describe it as constitutional pressure designed to activate executive self-correction before more serious institutional responses become necessary. The pressure campaign represents institutional courtesy before constitutional requirements. And here's what makes this pressure campaign unprecedented. Traditional support structures that insulate executive authority from institutional pressure are actively participating in constitutional accountability demands. The system isn't just responding to constitutional threats, it's systematically eliminating pathways for constitutional avoidance. Dr. Catherine Mills, who studies institutional pressure campaigns at Princeton, confirmed that when legislative, judicial, financial, and diplomatic pressure align simultaneously, the constitutional system is operating at maximum capacity. The coordination indicates institutional consensus about constitutional threats, but the pressure campaign escalating through every institutional channel is just preparation for what comes next, because the constitutional procedures being quietly prepared represent the most serious institutional responses available under American democracy. The inevitable reckoning approaches through constitutional mechanisms that will test every safeguard built into the American system. What happens next will define American democracy for generations. The constitutional mechanisms now activating represent the deepest safeguards built into the American system, and they're operating exactly as the founders designed. The procedural pathways ahead include constitutional authorities that haven't been fully exercised since the founding era, congressional oversight powers, 25th Amendment procedures, and institutional accountability mechanisms designed specifically for moments when executive behavior threatens democratic governance itself. According to constitutional experts familiar with the procedures being prepared, the timeline for institutional response operates on constitutional requirements rather than political calculations. The system activates automatically when institutional integrity faces systematic threats. No political consideration can override constitutional obligation. Think about what this means for American democratic institutions going forward. When bipartisan congressional coalitions form around constitutional concerns rather than political strategy, the precedent established affects every future administration. The institutional response being witnessed establishes constitutional accountability as institutional requirement. The implications extend far beyond individual political careers or partisan advantage. We're witnessing constitutional democracy proving that institutional safeguards function even under maximum pressure. The system designed by the founders is operating at full capacity to protect democratic governance from internal threats. According to Dr. Robert Chen, constitutional scholar at Harvard, the current institutional response represents the American constitutional system working exactly as designed, but operating at capacity levels not seen since the Civil War. When multiple branches of government align around constitutional concerns, democracy demonstrates its ultimate resilience. For both major political parties, this constitutional moment establishes precedents that will govern political behavior for decades. Republican willingness to prioritize constitutional obligation over political loyalty creates expectations for future constitutional crises. Democratic restraint during institutional pressure demonstrates constitutional respect over partisan advantage. The international implications affect American diplomatic relationships and global democratic credibility. Allied governments are observing constitutional procedures that prove democratic resilience under pressure. Authoritarian regimes are witnessing institutional accountability that demonstrates democratic strength rather than weakness. According to former ambassadors speaking on background, international confidence in American institutional stability depends entirely on constitutional procedures operating effectively during crisis moments. The world is watching constitutional democracy prove its functionality under maximum stress. But here's what makes this constitutional moment truly historic. The institutional response transcends political consideration entirely. Constitutional safeguards are operating according to foundational principles rather than contemporary political pressure. The system is proving its design integrity. What we're witnessing represents constitutional democracy at its most essential level, institutional accountability operating regardless of political consequence, constitutional obligation superseding partisan calculation.